Welcome back to the Crown Justice Society seminar series. Quick initial note, just to let you know, this is being recorded on the OWL. So if you don't want to be recorded, please leave the room now. Otherwise, we are here today with Professor Lindsay from the University of Glasgow, who is going to discuss market misconduct and criminal responsibility. With us today. He's going to talk for approximately 40 to 45 minutes, after which we move over to Q&A, where people can ask questions. If you are interested, it's fairly straightforward. Just raise your hand, and as soon as I spot you, if you have a follow-up to a question you can ask, give me a little half question kind of thing, so I'll know it's following. For anyone who's joining online, if you could just put a Q for a question or F for a follow-up in the chat, and I will keep an eye on that as well. Otherwise, over to you.
Okay, so well, thank you very much, Grant. It's always lovely to be back in Edinburgh. So I was slightly disoriented when I came to Edinburgh, and I was an undergraduate here. I think this was part of the library, so I think it was the room I used to come study in the library when I was an undergraduate. So it's kind of odd to be here all these years later. So the title is Calculative Agency and Moral Fault, and this, starting with a quote here from a French social theorist called Michel Calon. A market implies a peculiar anthropology, one which assumes a calculative agent, or more precisely what we might call calculative agencies. And I'm going to come back to this later on in the talk. But what I want to begin by saying, I mean, many of you know, not everyone, this is part of a larger project, and the larger project which I'm looking at is I'm writing a book which is called Criminalizing Market Misconduct, and I'm interested in the fact that criminal law theory and the literature on criminalization in particular has paid very little attention to the market, although markets are a central institution in liberal democratic societies. And it seems to me odd, both that the kind of philosophy of criminal law doesn't engage with markets as a central institution, and in the specific sphere of market crimes or market misconduct, if you like, there's been no engagement with the processes of criminalization, no theoretical engagement with the processes of criminalization that have been taking place since the 1970s, 1980s, and we've seen, a growth of crimes relating to forms of market misconduct, in particular, the financial crimes and financial markets, but not exclusively, since the 1970s and 1980s. So my project ambitiously is to try and write about that, think about the kind of concepts and language that we would, how we would engage with that. The paper today is a first go at what will be a chapter on the question of responsibility or agency. And what I'm thinking about is the relationship between ideas of agency in markets and ideas of agency in criminal law, and how do the two map onto each other. And so broadly speaking, what I'm arguing for is that criminal law needs to engage with this anthropology or sociology of markets a bit more systematically than it has done. That's the broad argument of the book. And one of the reasons for thinking about this is that we have a peculiar situation where there's been, as I've said, a kind of growth in the criminalization of market misconduct, but it's not been matched by a similar growth in the number of prosecutions or successful prosecutions. And this was exemplified by the financial crash of 2008. There were widespread calls to, as the caption says, arrest the bankers, to prosecute them. But of course, famously in the UK, there were no prosecutions of any bankers. Iceland, I think, was the only country that successfully managed to prosecute any bankers. There were some some reasonably high profile prosecutions in the US, but most of those were unsuccessful. So the question is, what's happening here? That there's this kind of mismatch between the growth of criminal law in this area, but the failures of prosecution. Is it simply that, sometimes this is argued or suggested that it's a failure of political will, or it's because these aren't really proper crimes and then the criminal law isn't appropriate. And so one of the things I want to think about is, well, if we think the criminal law is appropriate, then how would we think about the way that the crimes are conceived or criminal responsibility in this area in order to facilitate the use of the criminal law? So a starting point is this, what I'm calling here the problems of impunity. So this is, some of the reasons why these prosecutions have been unsuccessful. So, basically, some of these are kind of fairly straightforward. There's problems of individuating conduct. So that in financial markets, as we'll see, particularly where a lot of trading is automated, where it's happening at high speeds, where people are part of large organizations, that it's very hard to identify a particular individual who might have been responsible for a particular kind of outcome. So how would we disaggregate the different market effects in some way in order to identify a particular individual? And of course, this comes with associated problems of investigating. What kind of resources are required to investigate this sort of crime? I should say in this paper, at least in the form I'm kind of presenting today, I'm not going to engage with corporate responsibility. Ultimately, the chapter will engage with corporate responsibility, but this is just the first part of it, the foundation where I'm thinking about individual responsibility. A second issue is the problem of scale. Just, particularly in relation to the financial crisis, it's like, well, if there's a multi-billion-pound bailout of the banks, or massive losses that lead a bank to collapse, how do we relate that to individual, the individual conduct as well? Sometimes the scale of proportionality, it seems people are doing wrong things, but how do we match the one thing to the other in some way? There's a third issue, which is the question of criminalizing those who are only acting as expected by the market. So the markets, financial markets in particular, encourage risk-taking. Or there's it's suggested that there's a kind of moral ambiguity to market conduct, about which I'll say a little bit more later on. Is it possible to allege, for example, recklessness when market or speculative conduct is by its nature a matter of risk-taking? How can you decide what kind of risks are excessive or unreasonable risks? What's the measure of that? Is it what the market thinks? Is it what prosecution thinks? And the two things are not always going to be the same. It's also been suggested, and I put this in brackets because it's a political reason, but it's not central to my argument today. It's not a conceptual argument, but it was one of the reasons why the government was not keen on encouraging prosecutions in the aftermath of 2008 was they were worried it would discourage the necessary level of economic risk-taking, or it would cause damage to the economy. People felt they couldn't take risks. So in other words, in the aftermath of the economy, of the crash, the idea of economic recovery, it was argued that it was necessary to do what you could to foster the economic recovery rather than perhaps putting dampers on it by prosecuting people, putting resources into that. There are this is the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th point down here, well-publicized kind of questions about whether or not what might happen is a kind of problem of scapegoating. So criminalizing minor players while the kind of major players or privileged and powerful actors escape liability. that's what we've seen in the successful prosecutions. It's easy to go for the kind of more minor players rather than the people who are directing banks or in charge of other kind of organizations. But perhaps, you know, underlying or connected with all of these, there's difficulties of just applying a criminal law model of fault. So typically in criminal law, when we're prosecuting a crime or imposing liability, we're asking, were the harms foreseeable? Is there an identifiable wrongful act? Was it a culpable wrongful act? Is it possible to allege recklessness, as I said, when market or speculative conduct is by its nature a matter of risk taking? So the questions, you know, the central questions of the model of criminal liability, which is based not on a kind of regulatory forward-looking kind of model of you know, preventing not future crime, but on identifying the individual wrongful act, and that the individual is culpable in some way. It's difficult to do. It seems to be difficult to do that in this market conduct. So the question is, how do we overcome, if you like, these problems of impunity? So I'm juggling various things here, so I get this different pieces of paper and screens and so on. Try and get this right. So the question, in a sense, is more generally, you can see this in terms of the question of the relationship between markets and individual agency. So how do markets, if you like, frame responsibility? And we can see here that there's also contradictions in the way that, if you like, that markets conceive of or frame responsibility. On the one hand, you know, it's quite common, you know, that certain successful traders, if you like, are seen as people, you know, who kind of break through into kind of public consciousness. They're seen, you know, successful traders, some particular qualities about them that allow them to kind of stand out in some way. So we all know of the kind of my mind's gone blank. So we all know, and my mind's now gone blank. The sage of Nebraska, Warren Buffett, and other you know, successful traders who are, you know, seen as supremely successful. And there's this kind of idea that, you know, which is reflected in popular culture as well. The Wolf of Wall Street, these other kind of, you know, kind of movies about, you know, the risk taker, the person who's successful, who cuts through in some ways, able to exploit the market in certain ways. So there is this valorization of the individual. But on the other hand, there's, you know, accounts of the market. We're accustomed to talking about the market in terms of, you know, something which has its own, it is animate in its own way. We talk about the market speaking, the market moving. You can't fight the market, as Liz Truss found out only a few weeks ago. So the market, in a sense, is also conceived as an actor. So the market as an aggregate moves, acts, speaks in certain ways, and there seems to be a kind of, you know, a contradiction between, you know, or it's not clear how the ideas of the individual who can exploit the market and the perfectly functioning market which knows all and is, you know, is responding. And this is reflected also in kind of economic theory. There's a theory called, for example, the efficient capital market hypothesis, which, you know, postulates that, you know, the price of any given security on market at a given time reflects all available information about that is known about the value of a particular stock or security at that moment in time. But if that's right, then it would mean that nobody could ever beat the market, because the market always already knows. So, and this is, you know, this efficient capital market hypothesis is not something, you know, crackpot theory. I mean, it's a theory which is used to kind of frame, understand the way that, you know, financial markets actually operate in practice. So how do we think about the relationship between individuals and the market in this large sense? There's also questions about, you know, what kind of things are markets? Are they an ethical void, or are markets, you know, some accounts of markets see them as being self-disciplined, so that the market the unethical trader would get, people wouldn't trade with them. They would get kind of spat out of the market, if you like. They'd be disciplined. There's this idea of kind of market discipline. But the kind of contemporary kind of trend is away from the idea of seeing the market as being sort of self-disciplining and seeing the need for seeing that there is some sort of ethical void at the heart of the market, particularly financial markets. And there's a need. It's often, again, in the aftermath of 2008, it was being argued that there was a need for new kind of ethics and values in financial markets, and for people like Sir John Kay, who was leading a review of the Bank of England, that these kind of ethics and values should be backed by criminal law. And I put this kind of great quote from Sir Hector Sands, who was head of the Financial Services Authority in 2009. A principles-based approach does not work with individuals who have no principles. So it's kind of that. So you've got this idea of, we've got to have ethics, but more than that, the criminal law has a kind of role, in modeling those ethics, or in backing up the kind of breaches of those ethics. But if this is the case, the question remains: how do we hold individuals criminally responsible in the face of the accusing problems? In other words, the principles are going to have no purchase or bite, or they're not going to be capable of being backed by criminal law if the criminal law is not capable of being enforced. And that, to some extent, seems to me is the puzzle here that I'm trying to think about. So the question is, if we're going to try and embed these kind of values or in the market conduct in some way, we have to think about how that's done. So here, I thought it'd be interesting to kind of go back to kind of, if you like, first principles. So that's a picture, you probably recognize Jeremy Bentham. When he was alive, that's right, yeah.
I know his mummy.
Yeah. And so, if we're thinking about the kind of agency here, on the one hand, we have, if you like, the idea of homo economicus, which is and on the other, homo juridicus, if you like. So the question of, the models of the individual, who is at the heart of economic theory, economics, and of criminal law. And at one level, it would appear that they seem to kind of map onto each other. So the model of the rational calculating individual here, we have the quote from Jeremy Bentham. So the evil of the punishment must be made to exceed the advantage of the offense. So his account of the individual was a calculating individual, that the individual, when calculating whether or not to, or deciding whether or not to commit any crime, would perform a rough calculus and decide, would the benefit that I would accrue from this, would it outweigh any potential harm in the form of punishment? And Bentham, of course, famously argues then the calculus for the legislator is to design punishments at just the level at which they would outweigh the benefit in any given offense. If we jump forward probably nearly 200 years to Gary Becker, the Nobel Prize winning economist, in a famous article he wrote in 1968 called Crime and Punishment, an Economic Approach, he makes a very similar claim, and indeed cites Bentham in amongst the various equations and so on that he otherwise sprinkle the paper. So he says a person commits an offense if the expected utility to him exceeds the utility he could get by using his time and other resources at other activities. So it's essentially the same kind of idea. So there seems to be, if there is this affinity between the rationally calculating economic man and the rationally calculating juridical man, then one would perhaps expect that we wouldn't encounter the kind of problems that we encounter, but we rather do. I mean, it's also worth mentioning in this kind of connection the work of people like Alan Norrie, who's Chloe knows, she's been writing about this, who kind of has also argued that this kind of model of the rational calculating individual was sort of functional for the development of capitalism, in that he connects the abstracted individual of the criminal law, and which kind of blots out the social cause, or blacks, what's the word, blots out the social causes of crime, and reduces everything to kind of rationality. He argues this is actually functional for the development of capitalism, in that it means that criminal law doesn't have to engage with the social consequences, or capitalism doesn't have to engage with the social consequences. In some sense, it externalizes them, and criminal law, also externalizes them through use of the figure of the abstract individual. So as I say, we might expect that there's some sort of affinity here, but it seems, perhaps to break down. So I want to look in a little bit more detail at these ideas of the homo economicus and homo juridicus. And we can see that, there are kind of gaps or things which don't necessarily match up. So homo economicus, it's generally traced back to a claim made by John Stuart Mill, of all people, in his writings on political economy. John Stuart Mill wrote a 5-volume work on political economy, which is very interesting, but time-consuming. But he says political economy does not treat the whole of man's nature as modified by social state, nor of the whole conduct of man in society. It is concerned with him solely as a being who desires to possess wealth, and who is capable of judging the comparative efficacy of means of obtaining that end. And of course, what Mill is arguing here is he's not saying this maps onto any exact psychology. He's just saying that in order for economic theory to work, this is the model of man. I use the word man throughout because that's the language that is used here. This is the model of man that is used, that an economist needs to use in order to model economic theory. So you have it's certain assumptions. It's not a claim about reality. And in fact, this is to some extent what we see in later claims about rational action in the work of people like Gary Becker and so on. This claim it doesn't really map onto, although it's often taken as mapping onto an individual psychology. It's actually to some extent, it's about the market, so aggregate, how we would understand the market as being made up of an aggregate of individual preferences, all right? But it assumes that individual preferences are formed by people acting in a self-interested way. But to some extent, it doesn't rest on that. It's more that this is a way of modeling the system. So the model then becomes a proxy for the idea of a rational economic individual, rather than an actual claim about the individual psychology. It's not an account of, equally though, it's not an account of any actual markets. In the sense that actual markets, there's no institutional structures built into this account of markets. I mean, literally, if you look at, for example, the work of Becker, the market is modeled as a kind of formula. So it's preferences. There's one graph of preferences in one direction, and another graph of preferences move in the other direction. You're trying to find the kind of maximum welfare at the point two lines cross on the graph. So it's about modeling the aggregate rather than about the individuals. And in a sense, then the problem for economic theory has been, well, individuals act differently and they don't always act in this rational way. But that's seen as a secondary, in some ways as a secondary problem, because economics is about the kind of the modeling of the aggregate of the whole. Now, I could here go into, there are kind of things like behavioral economics, arguments about irrational exuberance and how bubbles form and so on, about how people act in irrational ways in market. It's not really germane to the argument here, in the sense that the idea of homo economicus as a whole is about not about any actual markets, and it's about the rational individual being produced as an artifact of the theory, rather than trying to build up from an account of individual action. So in other words, the problem for criminal law is that if we're thinking about individual action within a market, then economic theory is not telling us about anything about individual action within a market. It's thinking only about the aggregates, because it's looking at the problem, if you like, the other way around. We see, not necessarily difficulties. I guess as lawyers, we wouldn't see difficulties in the same way with homo juridicus. It's more familiar territory for us as lawyers. So what's important about homo juridicus is that it's the responsible subject of criminal law. Why is criminal law seen as being centered around the responsible subject? It's arguments about the need for respect for individual autonomy. Individuals should only be punished for morally wrongful conduct. Straight to the goes and it's based on, as you know, and there's different accounts of different kind of theoretical accounts of the nature of the responsible subject in terms of character or capacity and so on. But the kind of predominant understanding at the moment is one based on capacity, probably the capacity of the individual, whether they had whether they're able to choose certain outcomes, whether they had a fair opportunity to choose particular outcomes. And what it's about is identifying a subject of law who is capable of conforming to legal norms. So in some ways, as I've argued elsewhere, we can see it as a kind of artifact of criminal law. Criminal has to, in a similar way that say Alan Murray argues, the criminal law requires a certain degree of abstraction. It requires that we think of individuals as being individuals who are capable of conforming to the criminal law. And to some extent, it's not necessarily mapping onto, or it doesn't need to map onto an individual psychology. That might inform certain ways that we think about certain aspects of individual psychology in relation to, say, particular defenses or such like, but it perhaps not a necessary requirement. So the question is that, if you like, as a matter of responsibility practices, how can the agent, as conceived, conform to market norms? So in thinking of the agent as being, someone who can only be punished for morally wrongful conduct, one of the questions is there morally wrongful conduct in the market? What are the kind of relevant kind of moral norms, and what's the if you like, the responsibility of the individual in relation to those norms? So when we think of the responsibility practices, we're thinking about questions of awareness or knowledge of circumstances. You're thinking about whether or not a person was capable of having foresight of intended certain consequences or had foresight of those consequences, but perhaps also thinking in terms of in relation to concepts like dishonesty as a fault concept, or less directly related to agency. So we have to think about, overall then, we're thinking about the relationship between the kind of the self-interest of the actor in the market and the social functions of the market, and how the criminal law in some ways might track how we understand the social functions of the market, or the legitimacy of the market kind of going forward. So what I want to do at this point is to move and to think a little bit about agency in markets. And so my nice picture on the slide there, this is what PowerPoint fortuitously threw up as when it's kind of reading my text or whatever, how you say the word markets, the image. But actually, it's, yeah, subject of a different talk, perhaps. It's actually quite a germane kind of image, because that, you know, one of the things, one of the issues of thinking particularly about financial markets here is that, so if you're as old as I am, I can remember when going to the stock exchange in London meant going to a kind of large room with a big dome where people shouted at each other, right? They would ring a bell at the start of trading every day, and then people wearing different kind of ribbons on their jackets or different colored jackets or whatever yelled for, you know, 4 hours. The bell rang again, they stopped yelling, they had lunch, and then they would start again. You know? And so if you watch, I mean, for those of you who are not as old as I am, to everybody, if you watch films like Trading Places, and so on, you see kind of representation in Chicago, the trading floor. And the idea was, you know, so that you were dealing with people in some sense, even in a financial market, you were dealing with people face to face. And so the market was literally the place you went to, in the same way that you might go to a farmer's market, or even, I guess, a supermarket, something like that. It's somewhere where you go and you're dealing in some sense with an individual. Of course, markets are increasingly online. So how do we think of the market? We think of the market like that. It's a representation, it's numbers on screen, which are kind of going up and down, it's graphs. And there is no place anymore where people are literally meeting face to face. There are trading floors of particular kind of companies which apparently are noisier. I haven't actually been to them, but the trading such as is happening in hyperspace, cyberspace, is happening, is driven by algorithms which are programmed to buy or sell at certain prices, stock to shares at certain prices. There are whole, you know, books written about how the high-speed trading is often kind of relying on kind of minute, you know, milliseconds in order to kind of, you know, exploit very small price differentials in the speed of, you know, fiber optic wires running between certain places and so on. Now, all of this is, you know, it's kind of, you know, I'm not much of a technology nerd. It's still kind of fascinating, and it's sort of, you know, we can see what's going on. But, you know, one of the interesting things about that is that, you know, if you think about social relations, then the way that we would, you know, if you let's say you go to your local shop or a local store where you're known, or a market where you're known, then because you're a repeat customer or because you're seeing people face to face, then the engagement in that, the social relationship does, if not exercise a discipline over you, you might care what other people think. If you want to go back and shop in the same place again, you're going to risk, you know, you have some sort of personal relationship which is underlying the economic relationship. In fact, you might even think of it in, the relationship with your local shop in terms of the personal relationship rather than the economic relationship. The economic relationship is secondary. What we actually have now in financial markets is just very abstract. So where the trading in fact resembles the model, the abstract model of economics, because it doesn't seem to be embedded in social relationships in the same way. No people are involved. No people, no people were harmed in the making of something or other. But no people, you know, the people are just. You don't have to engage with anyone. It's happening at high speed. It's highly complex. So it's summed up nicely in this quote from a sociologist Marcus called Caitlin Zaloom, where she says, "Technology creates a new image of the market which displays its own observable trends and rules organized around the price of currencies, securities, and commodities." And she, in fact, carried out a fascinating study of the transition in Chicago, I think, of the move from the kind of in-person trading floor to the kind of automated trading floors. But what's key about this is the idea that the representation of the market becomes the model of the market. and then reflexively operates back on whether or not we think the market is functioning in an efficient or in a proper way. And this is reflected also in terms of the policing of markets. So how does the policing of these kind of financial markets work? Now, whereas in an old face-to-face trading, you would look for literally signs that somebody had hadn't made a pre-agreement with somebody else, or you could tell if somebody wasn't going to deliver on, they were making offers. You'd know if they were making offers or bids for something that they couldn't afford to back or whatever it was. The way that policing works with the highly automated markets is there's a second program, computer program, which runs, which looks for irregularities in trading patterns. So in other words, it directly replicates what we think the market ought to look like, and the policing then is looking for something which doesn't map on to the model of what the market ought to look like. So we might ask then, well, so what is deception, or what is cheating in this kind of model? All right, because cheating is not, it's not in the sense of something face to face, or and there's certainly in the sense no kind of constraint in the sense of worrying what other people might think about you, who are people you're engaging with in any kind of direct way. That the gap between the writing of the algorithm that is running this, or the instructions given to the algorithm, and the conduct that happens. There may be many trades which happen before the offensive pattern kind of emerges in the tracking algorithm, the tracking computer program. So, but also it's been argued, and there's a very interesting work by a Canadian sociologist called James Williams, who's looked at the policing of markets using these kind of tracking programs. He argues that because the people who are trading on markets also know that the tracking programs operate in certain ways, that the tracking programs are only picking up, if you like, superficial irregularities. They never are going to go to anything, they're not going to be capable of picking up anything deeper, or that would only emerge as an outcome of a more sustained investigation. Now, of course, what's interesting about this is that this is also, these changes in the market in terms of complexity, automation, and uncertainty are reflected in the way that certain offences are conceived. So when there are new offences of, for example, market manipulation, but what the if you like, the interest that these offences of market manipulation is trying to protect is an interest of what in market integrity, understood as the market, the price formation process of markets is the market integrity being respected, rather than looking, we can't track dishonesty in the same way. So this is, if you like, this is one of the these are the problems that we face in terms of thinking about what agency looks like, in the sense that the way that markets are understood is increasingly in terms of the kind of models, the economic models of economic theory that we see that I talked about when I was talking about the homo economicus, and it's very hard to kind of track back from that to think about what individual fault or individual agency before you even get to kind of individual fault. Where is individual agency happening? And what does it look like, and how would we recognize culpable individual agency? I'm doing for time. Now, in a sense, this is where also I start running out of ideas. I'm trying to identify the problem, and I don't have particularly kind of good answers here. But what I've been thinking about is so this is coming back to the quote from Michel Calon that I started with. Is trying to think about using some of his ideas to try and think through the sort of problem. So what Calon is asking as a sociologist rather than as an economist is under what conditions are decisions calculable? For him, that's a question of how a market's possible in the face of uncertainty. And what he argues is that this can't be a matter of individual psychology because of the conditions of uncertainty. It's simply, individuals, he challenging that individuals are not necessarily born calculating individuals; they're made calculating individuals by markets. This is and the kind of argument, he's got a lot of anthropological kind of evidence to kind of back this up. Another kind of common argument, and this is what we saw in the argument from at the start of the paper, that from people like Sir John Kay and Hector Sands, is the problem is how to embed certain values, so that there's kind of quite a common argument, a famous argument made by a sociologist called Michael Polanyi, who said there's a kind of the development of capitalism saw a process of abstraction as people were kind of abstracted out of their kind of their traditional forms of life, and sort of the capitalist economic market developed. But then people were re-embedded in the sense that there's a kind of always an ongoing process of abstraction and then re-embedding as social relations reassert themselves, and that people in these kind of situations are cooperating with each other, and so that there develop shared social values or shared ethical positions. So the importance of relationships, so that it's like basically saying, well, even though we're dealing with abstracted models, then there's always something pulling you back to even in the kind of the computerized world, at some point you have to be dealing with some people, and that they're going to be anchoring you sort of in the real world. And he's also skeptical about this kind of position because he's saying, he argues, well, if there's only shared values, then where's the scope for individual action? It's like, how the shared values, how would people be acting differently? Where's individual autonomy or agency operating? So his argument instead is about what he calls framing. And the idea that, and so there's a long quote here: framing is an operation which is used to define agents who are clearly distinct and dissociated from one another. It allows for the definition of objects and goods which can be separated from other objects, from other goods, and from the actors involved. It's owing to this framing that the market can exist. So the argument is saying that, if we didn't have framing, then every time we had to make a calculation, in a sense, we'd have to calculate everything, all future possibilities in all kind of possible worlds. So framing allows for setting some boundaries around that. So the question is, the framing becomes a way of limiting the amount of calculation, marking the boundaries, externalizing certain things as not being part of the calculation. But also, it becomes the way of thinking about the calculative agent. So it's the market, he's arguing, that produces the calculative agent. So there's not if you like, an underlying psychology of this. The market is producing the calculating agent. So but this is a continually ongoing process. It's not a process that ends. It's something that is, the boundaries, the framing is continually being made and remade. And I think where this is interesting is that it's rather than saying that we take the market as given, as a thing which is there, or take the agent as a thing which is given or thing is there, is directing us to focus attention on the institutions of the market, the process of the market, the way the particular markets are made. What are the kind of relations that are seen as being within the market, and where the boundaries of the market lie, what's external to that? What is the temporality? And I think is a key kind of question when we're dealing with questions of uncertainty, is like thinking about there's a time limit to this process. So when the calculations are being made, we're not calculating infinitely into the future. There's, we're thinking about when kind of profit can be expected, or when a return is expected, and also about what is externalized. So just the sort of then the kind of rather vague conclusion is thinking that, so when we think about things like trust or ethical conduct in markets, we can't turn back the clock, but we're not going to find these in older conceptions of social relationships, because the markets aren't there anymore. The markets have moved on. So we have to engage with the kind of markets that there are. We have to think about the place of markets in society, so that the legitimacy of markets. So we're not thinking about how, if you like, when we're thinking about the role of criminal law, it's not thinking solely about the criminal law taking the market's account, or economics account of the market for granted, but it has to kind of challenge that, because the function of the criminal law is to assist in framing authorized actions and relations. So it's thinking about the criminal law as being one of the framing devices in relation to the market, in order to think about the kind of values or relations that are involved. So then, in terms of thinking about uncertainty or risk, we're thinking about not just we go back to the kind of the impunity problems that I started with. Some of the impunity problems around the foreseeability, for example, then it's necessary that the criminal law be kind of framing certain kinds of foreseeability, or thinking about how we frame certain kinds of foreseeability, thinking about the response. The other way I'm trying to think about this is perhaps in terms of the way that responsibility should get distributed in markets. So the first step being thinking about who should be responsible for what, rather than, and then criminal fault can follow from that, rather than thinking, sort of trying to think about it, as I think most of the stuff I've read that on this so far is trying to think about this ex post facto, as like something terrible has happened. How do we think back to that? So I appreciate this is a little bit vaguer than I'd like it to be, and so I look forward to your kind of comments and questions if there are any. So it's more about the direction of travel. I'm trying to think this through. I'm trying to identify kind of what the issues are, and then how we try and, given if this is the right diagnosis, is the right problem that I'm diagnosing, how we would then think, try and arrive at a possible solution. Because I think the existing suggestions are not particularly helpful in terms of getting us down that route. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.